Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Exceptional Podcast. So, today we are having a look into mental health and teenagers, and in particular, how that looks like in neurodivergent individuals. Our guest today is Kay Reeves, an emotional awareness expert, author, mentor, and TEDx speaker. Wow. They support neurodivergent teens, those who are struggling with depression and emotional regulation, which I'm sure a lot of us can resonate with. They have developed their own model called the Mood Mentor model that I definitely look forward to hearing a bit more about soon. They've authored numerous books, one including The Brain Unchained, a self-help book. Today, we are going to be having a real focus on the emotional challenges that come along with adolescence and being neurodivergent. So without further delay, Kay, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Nat. Thank you. I'm excited to learn more about myself after hearing all of that.
That sounds good. Kay, I would love to hear from your perspective if you could just give us a bit of an introduction about who you are and what you are all about.
Yes, certainly. Let's say Kay Reeves as an emotional awareness expert. And that began, I would say, around probably just over 30 years ago when I gave birth to my son. And I often felt like he was born depressed. He always had emotional challenges, even through nursery, play school, right through until he was about 8 years old. He was finally diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder. In those days, it was referred to more commonly as Asperger's, but that's changed now. He was also by that time suicidal on a daily basis and had actually first tried to take his own life at the age of 8. I was at my wit's end and didn't know what to do, and I ended up home educating him to keep him alive. We had a couple of good years, and then teenage hormones kicked in. Life went downhill again, and by the time he was about 19, I had been his emotional paramedic 24/7 so many times, I'd lost track of it. I was constantly terrified what was going to happen to him day to day. I lived in a constant state of stress with it. And then we sat in the car one night for about 3 hours, and again, I was just talking him out of that real pit of depression. And I had the mental health phone number on my phone ready to dial. And he's going, just give me another minute. And it was in that moment that a light bulb went on for me, that he was a visual learner and he couldn't understand his emotions because he couldn't see them. That was where my mission began that night, was how to help him see his own emotional cycle so that he could learn to take control of his own emotions. And I went with him into his flat where he was living at the time. And I sat making notes on the back of an envelope with him about the core emotions. And we started to talk about his emotions in terms of colour. And from there, he changed so rapidly and just engaged in conversation even from that very night. And that was the last time he ever talked of dying. And the result of that, as Nat says, was me coming up with the book Brain Unchained. And on the back here is the emotional cycle diagram that saved his life and now hopefully save other people's too.
Wow, that's a really nice intro, and not nice in terms of nice, but in terms of uplifting, that there was a positive outlook towards the end. Life is never rags to riches. There's always ups and downs. So I'd be curious if you could share maybe a bit about where are you now?
Yeah, certainly. He's 30 years old now. He's married, 2 children, got a job, drives a car, living a normal life. I remember hearing one of yours about how difficult it is for people with neurodiversity to actually find employment. The night that we actually sat down and started working on this process, we sat down over a cup of coffee, and then I'd go back and talk to him day after day about this. And very often he liked to have a pot of tea, and he likes it from a proper pot and a couple of cups. And he has this thing about a really good quality pot of tea. And for him, there was something even before then. We used to have this safe space for talking, as it's known. And it was that ability to be able to sit down and just listen to him and let him open up during that time we had a pot of tea. And now he actually works in a coffee shop, and he loves the concept of people just sitting talking over a pot of tea or a cup of coffee. And he loves interacting with people through his work. And he's actually very sociable. very well loved by all the people that know him, and just a completely different. I mean, he's still who he is, but he's
Yeah.
just a completely different person emotionally and just so engaged with life now. It's amazing.
I think a lot of people find that really reassuring, particularly that when you are a parent with an autistic child, it can feel like doom. I know my mum, she fought so hard for me because I was very emotionally delayed. It took me like twice as long to learn everything compared to my peer. But again, okay now. But I think just saying that it will be okay later isn't enough. You do have to put in the work, and clearly you have. This brings me on to my first question on our discussion, and it is, how do neurodivergent teens experience emotions differently from neurotypical teens?
Absolutely. I wouldn't be putting my title on there if I couldn't. It is a really good question, actually. And at the end of the day, we all have those same core emotions, which are happy, sad, angry, and depressed. If I just hold this up briefly on the back of the diagram again, this is what my diagram encapsulates: is happy, sad, angry, and depressed. So happiness is all those high emotions. Angry and sad are like the fight and flight, the sort of the battle between which way do I go. And depression is that pit stuck in the rock bottom. Now, every human being has that same emotional cycle, and we all change between emotions because something changed. For people who are neurodivergent, the best way I can describe this, it's like looking at a pinpoint through a microscope, and it looks massive. And it's like when you look at a little insect through one of those big spectral microscopes, and it looks like this big scary alien bug. And so where neurotypical people feel the emotion and then flow through it, for somebody with, whether it is autistic spectrum, ADHD, whatever it is, there's so many different versions of neurodiversity that it really is. It's just like they feel it and it blows up. And I don't know if that resonates with you as well, with what you went through. But that's the best way I could describe it with my son. If it made him a little bit irritated, it was full on rage.
Yeah.
And if he got a little bit overwhelmed, it was like the pits of depression. And it was just like whatever it is, just expanded and multiplied and magnified 10 to 100-fold over anybody else. And then that was a lot to deal with, and quite a traumatic sensation and sort of group of feelings in itself. And it was learning to help him control that back in to something that he could manage himself. So
I think that definitely aligns with my own experience quite well. I normally use the analogy of a speaker, that when you turn the dial up and you amplify it, you're not changing the music, but you are heightening the experience. This kind of brings me nicely onto a follow-up question on the back of that is, what are the particular struggles that you notice more often than not? Are there typical pitfalls that you find most ND teens tend to fall into?
yeah, that's a more interesting one, because with the 4 core emotions, they can fall into any of them. So with the anxiety, the stress, the depression, basically, if you're not happy, you are one of the other 3. But what triggers them into going to there is really the pitfalls. Whether it is somebody said something and they were focused and it's a distraction, and it was the tone of voice that kind of ended up being like that amplified sound. So I think actually it ties in with the sensory moderation. So you're in a mindset and you're trying to focus on something, and whether we all exist in the world through 5 senses, and we don't experience the world in any other way than through those 5 senses, even if it's just things we're thinking about. And so for people on the autistic spectrum, when one of those 5 senses is activated, but they were focused on another, they find it hard to switch between them. And then that hits that amplification mode. So if it's focused on something and suddenly there's a bright light or a loud sound or there's movement nearby on the table, when they're sitting in school. And one of the things I used to see them struggle with in school, and because I used to go and help sometimes, was he'd be trying to write and the next child is perhaps rubbing their work out and the whole table is shaking or something. And when you've got that, plus the lights coming in and all the sounds moving around and the teacher calling out orders over the top and the bells going off, he was so traumatized by school. That ended up being one of the reasons that early on he was actually suicidal. But it took me a while to realize and actually understand and learn about all this. But once I took him out of that environment, that did settle some of that quite quickly. But obviously that's not an option for everybody.
It reminds me of another analogy that I normally use to explain that, is that when people think of, oh, I'm a great multitasker, actually human beings are terrible multitaskers, because our brain can't actually do multiple things. But what it does is go switch them really quickly. And again, for neurodivergent people, that switch might be slightly delayed and eventually it can build up. So it feeds in exactly to what you said, that it's when there's too much data around you and you're still processing the last thought and the next thought has already arrived. It's very overwhelming.
Yeah.
What would you do? Say someone was in that situation. Is there anything you can do in the moment to re-regulate yourself without making a scene almost?
I think when we're talking more towards the teenagers and young adults end rather than younger children, it's about learning themselves to recognize those feelings building up and being able to catch them, first of all, and take a breath. So it's being able to stop, take a breath or a moment to think, and then being able to catch that reaction before it happens and reframe that into perhaps a question. Okay, I didn't quite catch that. Can you repeat it? Or can you take me through that one step at a time? Can I go and sit somewhere quieter or away from whatever's going on? And I think it is being able to recognize that something is aggravating them and turning it into a conversation rather than a meltdown or an outburst. And being able to be constructive with it. And it's not easy for everybody to do straight away, and it does take practice. Everybody can learn to do this. We ideally want to help people avoid that extent of it as well, ending up suicidal, ending up in prisons, committing crimes and outbursts. So it's being able to regulate that back in and catch those emotions, stop them, even if it's doing some form of mindfulness first as well, and trying to self-regulate. And then if it doesn't work, bringing that forward into interdependence and working with people rather than against them, and realizing people are there to support when you can express what is troubling you. But I know for a lot of them, they're not aware of what's troubling them and they have to learn that first. What is it that's triggering them off? And then when you know the trigger, then you can catch it and address it with people who can support them.
So it really does seem like it's building that internal translator in your head. So when the world is overwhelming, you can either communicate it to someone who may be able to support you, or that the frustration has to come out some way, and it either comes out in the form of a meltdown or maybe a criminal activity, or it could come down to something positive. That really makes you start to think about, why is there so many neurodivergent people who are in the prison system or are on some probation or something along those lines? And it starts to make sense, is that when you are getting continuously overwhelmed, you feel like a kettle about to erupt, or a volcano even.
Yeah, absolutely. And certainly by the time they're moving into young adults and they're in relationships, and then very often going on into having families and such, if they're still at that point not learning to regulate those emotions, that's when we end up with abuse as well in relationships. And this just goes down a whole other rabbit hole from there. But this is why it's important to catch it early and give them the power to learn to regulate these emotions themselves, to take control of their own emotions. But as he was learning it, the changes happened so quickly. It was literally weeks before one of his friends sat down with us over a cup of coffee and just said, I've realised that hanging around with Matt makes me a better person. And this took weeks, not months or years. So if he could change that rapidly from the extent he was at, he was a shell of himself. I really felt like my son was almost not in this body that was walking around. And to come back to that level that quickly, this is just so empowering. I couldn't keep it to myself from there.
I want to know more about it. You've already spoken a bit about your model. I'd love to know if you could break it down a bit more so we can really grasp it and how it would help someone.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first question I had with him was, how can I explain his emotions to him? So that was where, as I say, I came up with the 4 core emotions. And I realized that very much like an oil painting or any piece of artwork boils down to primary colors. There are over 6,000 words in the English dictionary that describe emotions, and yet they all sit within those same 4 core emotions: the happy, sad, angry, depressed. The next thing is I wanted him to understand the need for being positive against being negative and depressed. And so we talked about happiness being a high vibration, a high mood, it's uplifting. And all of the language that we use about happiness is higher. When we talk about something we're excited about, our voice goes up. And when we're depressed, it goes down. And it was this whole dynamics. You imagine at the stadium full of football fans when their side wins a goal. Yeah, like this. The other team have got their hands down going, oh. So the whole dynamics of being human fit within this diagram. And that is all described in the first third of the book, basically. And then I started to look at it with him in terms of, okay, so say, for example, he was happy one day, and next thing I know, he's in a total rage. He changed emotions because something changed. What was it? And so we started to look at what changed in him. So orange represents the change, either inner change with his thoughts, his feelings, his beliefs, versus all the external changes in the outer world, interactions with other people, something he read, music he listened to, somewhere he went. But it was understanding the outer world versus his internal world and how that changes his emotions. And that was either positively or negatively. So if something affected his emotions negatively, what could he do to create the changes back to go back to feeling more positive? And that was what then suddenly gave him that purpose. And the other part was recognizing that when you are in the pits, stuck in a rock bottom, in the darkness, all the terminology we use for depression, that for many people, they feel when they're down here, like that's where they hit that sense of suicidal feeling. And for many, it's, is a decision they take, and regrettably for family and so on. But down here, it was helping him to recognize that when he felt suicidal, it just meant for him that he was the worst point in that moment. But like a cycle, when it goes round, the emotional cycle is always going round to a degree, but we want to try and catch it earlier, not let it go all the way down. But when he was at the bottom, it was making him realize that they say the only way is up. On this diagram, it is. So unless suicide is the option they choose, which we don't want them to, it's helping them to understand that if you are down here emotionally, then there is a purpose for working back up here. It's like the map. But also recognizing that the only way we go from happiness to depression is actually through something that made us sad. You tend not to go straight from happiness to depression without going through one of the other emotions.
Makes sense.
But equally, we have to work back through our problems to come back to being happy. Because the other option is to skip solving the problems to become happy. That's when addictions become in, and unhelpful behaviors, repetitive behaviors. It just gave him that power of going, okay, I'm feeling really down today. How can I talk myself out of this? And so by the time we'd been doing this for a few months, he went from sort of me frequently talking him out of that pit of depression for 3 hours at a time to one day I was at work, I got a phone call to say, oh, Mum, I just talked myself out of one today in 10 minutes. It was one of the best things I could have heard that day. I heard that he had talked himself back out of that state by understanding that process, and to a point where he'd eventually just manage that himself. And it's very rarely now that he will actually call me at that level. In fact, he hasn't done for a long time. And it was just so great to know that he had that ability to control that himself. And I didn't have to feel like I was constantly on an emergency call for him. I could breathe. As a mum, I could again, and that was a freedom for me as well as for him.
He was really able to develop his own kind of guide rails and at least have a first port of call before seeking the emergency help. Because I think that's a lot of thing that people neglect, is that neurodivergent people don't live on their own. They typically do have a network, and that can put a lot of stress and pressure. And one thing that I've personally witnessed is that because it is hereditary, normally that the parents may be undiagnosed and they are also struggling So you're just like layering up the struggle.
You just hit the nail on the head there. Yeah,
Like,
yeah. I did not know that I had neurodiversity until about 3 years ago, and I'm still waiting for a diagnosis. And I realised about 3 years ago that mine is ADHD. And it's only a few months ago I realised I actually have a form of dyslexia as well. So while I can read and write, I realised there are other forms of dyslexia that definitely apply to me. I was so busy helping my son for so many years, I never looked at me. I did, but I could never figure out what it was. And there was something in the back of my mind a little bit. But no, everybody looked at me and told me I was the normal one. So, and then I find out I'm not. And it was only 3 years ago I managed to piece all that together and say, now I get it.
From the sounds of it, I would probably assume that your undiagnosed ADHD probably was that kind of relentless, never giving up factor, which allowed you to get help for your son regardless, just keep pushing through it. Because sometimes we have these blinkers on, which might make us seem like we lack self-awareness. But on the other hand, it gives us this undying need to get to the other side. But on that other side, on your wheel, I'm out of curiosity, is it linear where it has to go around, or can it go backwards?
For example, something's made you angry and then you get overwhelmed with it. And then to start with, it goes backwards. So if somebody starts to make you angry and then you go, actually, I choose to think a bit differently about that, you can go back to being happy. So the main thing is wherever you jump between emotions, you only jump one at a time, not two at a time. So you can jump from there to there or there to there, or whatever. But you always got to go through the orange first. So it's either got to be a change. So if you drop something and you go, dropped it, you pick it up again. So physically, if you drop something, you pick it up. But when things affect our emotions, do you change that emotion back by your thoughts, choose to think differently about it, or by creating an action? So is it something that you choose to say or have an interaction with somebody about, conversation? So it's like the thought process and conversation externally, or something that's more of a physical action. There's a lot to it. But actually, when it comes to the internal and external changes, there's actually the second part of the mood mentor model, continuing with that question. In trying to work out, and this took me about 3 years in total to complete the model, I realized that there were only 5 changes in the whole world that we can face. And being an administrator in the past, I've done a lot of office work and filing, and I'm good at categorizing and problem solving. So when you're talking about being blinkered and relentless and never giving up, I think for me on the ADHD brain, that's the problem solving part. I won't quit until I've solved the problem. Okay, so we've got this change, but what does change mean? And I ended up with a strategy called HELPS, which is health, emotional, logical, physical, and social. And it's very similar, though I hadn't heard of this at the time, it's very similar to the 5 love languages, but it's the 5 changes in the world that can happen. And so that was the second part of my strategy. It has to be one of those 5. And then eventually there were some bits that I couldn't quite tie in, like time and money. And then I ended up with this completely separate one, was actually they're the root causes. If I'm trying to do something, I might be calm as anything doing it. But if somebody suddenly puts a deadline on it and I've got a time constraint for getting it completed, I might get stressed. So the difference between me being calm or stressed could be the root cause is time. Information, so it might be missing information that helps, time and energy. So when I broke this down into this whole process, gave me this entire strategy where for parents picking the book up and learning that strategy, they have the ability to use that process to ask the right questions to support their teenagers back out of depression, stress, anxiety, and so on. And so for me, at this point, it went beyond a tool to help him. So the diagram helped him. But the second 2 parts of the strategy gave me the tools to support him, because life doesn't just stop by understanding the core emotions. There was still a lot more to life. And that, to me, was where the full power of the book came in as a parenting book, as well as a teenage and young adult book. That encapsulates the whole mood mentor model.
It makes a lot of sense, and I could definitely see how it'd be useful. Though I also do see a lot of parallels with other models, maybe like Burnout cycle or CBT. And that kind of leads me on to ask you, where do you see like the differences? For instance, when would you use this model opposed to another model? Is it the same, just slightly different, or are they not related?
That's a fascinating question, and I love it. For me, every single model out there has value, and every personal development model is there to solve an emotional issue. They are there to solve a problem that is creating emotional barriers and to help people. And yet, when my son was going through those pits of depression, as with many people, they can't connect with those models if they haven't understood their emotions first. And so there have to be a certain level of emotional awareness to be able to then connect with those other strategies. And I think a good way for me describing burnout on here is saying we all want to be happy. As human beings, we're all driven to be happy. We naturally seek it. And I can't think of a person in this world who would not seek happiness. But we automatically feel the fight, flight, or the anger and sadness. And they drag us down. And when we start to lose sight of what makes us happy and we get dragged down and you end up down here, the burnout is where you lose that. And you end up feeling like you've lost the motivation and the spark to keep moving into that motivation, to keep seeking happiness. It's about learning to find that spark and that motivation and that purpose again. And there's lots of things that can cause that, managing energy levels around those emotions. But then there's others, like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a really powerful one. And it goes through all the physiological needs right through to the higher purpose. And when he talks about physiological needs for air, water and food, this emotional cycle diagram fits through every single one of those. In order, air is the most important thing first before water. If you're suddenly finding yourself starved of air, your emotions are going to change until you get air back, and then you go big, relief, and then happiness again. And then you go, I'm thirsty. So you'll go through that emotional cycle again, looking for water. When you've got that and your thirst is quenched, you're like, relaxed, happy again. So you come back to happiness as a sense of accomplishment for every stage. Then you want food. And then when you've got that, you want shelter and love and purpose and all of that. And the emotional cycle follows through with every single step of the way. And when any one of those is taken out, the whole tower above crumbles back down to that most important need next, the priority one. And so for me, with all of the personal development models available, and I've got a book that is full of them here, this underpins all of them and doesn't compete with any of them. They're all about solving emotions, and this is the emotional cycle. So for me, this is like the blueprint to every emotional strategy out there.
I totally agree with you that they shouldn't compete with each other, and different models are beneficial in different scenarios. A question that I had later on, which I think I'll actually bring up, is that a lot of these models were developed with, I think, a neurotypical mind in the forefront. For example, CBT, which is often recommended for people who might be struggling with, OCD or obsessive thoughts. I remember a few years back now, I was really struggling with my mental well-being, and they diagnosed me with OCD. And I went and had mental health support, but the support available just did not work for me. And I think the reason for it is that the idea is that you want to be aware of your emotions so you can break them down. But for me, I felt like I was too aware of my emotions and I became obsessed with them. So yeah. I was just wondering if you got any comments on that in terms of how traditional models might be at odds with a neurodivergent mind.
Yeah, I think, again, that comes back to that core emotional understanding. As CBT is about reframing those internal thoughts, feelings, and beliefs. And for many neurodivergent people, if they haven't got this understanding about how that internal process affects the core emotions and haven't understood how their own emotional language works, once they get that understanding of that emotional cycle, it gives them a reason for then connecting with things like the CBT. Or it could be some NLP or something else. Somebody else might like to go and do crystal therapy with the different coloured crystals or the sound baths and things. But everybody will find a way to create their own healing But yes, so for me, understanding this gives them the power to plug into all of those other models and understand them better.
Understood. So from what you're saying is that it's not that the other models are necessarily not right for neurodivergent people, but it
Correct.
might mean that they need a more foundational model to understand the basic needs first.
Yeah. I think it's actually a very quick way I can describe this, and it's a very visual way. I'm very much about visual learning because that's where it came from. If you imagine this is neutral ground for most people, neurotypical. And for most people, even neurotypical, personal development is like a step up. And then we go on the ladder for success. So we call it the ladder to success from here. So it's a step up. And even neurotypical people tend to need mentors, coaches, and life coaches and trainers who teach them ways to self-improve. And it could be through videos, it could be through books, it could be through actual mentoring and coaching in person. But it's like giving them a bunk up to that first rung on the ladder because it's a big step. Now imagine the person who is neurotypical, who is struggling with stress, anxiety, depression, is stuck in a rut. And who is going to help them make that step? So this is where all of those other modelling strategies begin. And all of a sudden that gap is bigger when they've got the neurodiversity. So that's where, for me, the Brain Unchained book and the Mood Mentor model gives them that lift, not only back up to neutral ground, but gives them potential for getting back up onto the rest. And there's no reason they can't have the success that anybody else has without that intention of learning that missing gap at the bottom. Because for most human beings, learning and understanding our emotions should be an inherent part of being human.
Yeah.
But specifically on the autistic spectrum, it's like that ability is taken away to inherently learn and understand emotions. So it creates that bigger sort of deficit between where they are and where they want to be. And for me, this strategy helps to fill that gap and bring them back up to a level where they can access life just as anybody else does.
It seems that does make a lot of sense the way you put it there. Because if you look at the kind of life journey of a typical, if there is such a thing, neurodivergent person, is that as they have neurodevelopmental delays, things do tend to take a little bit longer. I was about 2 years behind my peers through all of my adolescence. But the reason it's called a delay, and I would say not a deficit, is that delays eventually do catch up. And I think this support sounds like it allows you to get back on track to where your other peers are, so you can continue along the same journey. I would argue when people say the strengths of being neurodivergent is that kind of perseverance, I think that perseverance comes from that adversary. And as you said from your son, they would not be where they are today had they not had that struggle. That doesn't make that struggle any funner, but it is integral to their journey.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, like you're saying, delay versus deficit. For me, even with a delay, there are people out there, 50, 60, 70s, who are still down there in that rut because they've never had that opportunity to do that catch up, that developmental catch up. And they're still struggling with emotions and depression, and they have done lifelong because nobody's given them the tools to fill that missing gap that's not been an inherent part of learning. And if we can empower teachers and parents and coaches and therapists to support these teenagers and young adults, I think the most powerful way of doing this is by giving the people who are supporting them the tools to help them at the point where they need that help, and helping them to catch up from earlier on. I'd like to see this strategy in the national curriculum, and that's going to be a mammoth task. I'm going to need help with that. I won't be doing it alone. Especially with a lot of neurodivergent people, they are visual learners. It's like trying to teach time and concepts. I've found a lot of people with autistic spectrum disorders are very challenged with concepts that are invisible, like time, like money, and distance and spaces. And so it's like for time, that's made visible by teaching it on a clock. And that was where the question came up that night in the car with my son. How can I help him to see his emotions? And there wasn't that visible tool, which is what I've now created. So how could schools teach something in a visual format without the tools to do it? And I've developed that now to a stage where I feel that I could pitch this forward into the national curriculum in the future to give a lot more people with neurodiversity that chance to catch up on that developmental delay from within the education system.
Hey, that's
But for now, we need to catch up in the middle and give other people a chance to catch up and have the power of this from home for themselves.
That's a very ambitious goal, but one that I completely applaud and would back you 100. I love the idea that we need to be able to visualize it in order to grasp it. Otherwise, that kind of gap between neurodivergent and a neurotypical person widens. And that is exactly what we see in the education system, is that people who struggle early on typically stay in the bottom sets, and those who are doing well get better and better. It gets to the point where we're getting to the ridiculous scale that you've got some people who are going to university, getting high-end jobs, and other people who end up in a life of crime. And they all have the same potential, but if the people who might have certain delays aren't nurtured to begin with, the gap just widens and widens. I love the idea of making sure that there's this kind of translator layer where people are able to say, okay, that is what I'm thinking. That's how I can understand it. Now I have the tools necessary to be able to partake in this neurotypical world, because that's the world we live in.
Yes. I suppose in a way it's a bit like wearing glasses. If you take glasses off, we can't see as well as the average sighted person.
Exactly.
So we need a little set of tools here to help us catch up with what the rest of the world can see. For me, I got hearing aids as well, but it's time you've got the whole, it's having that little thought process to help you tap into it and see it clearer and feel it and be able to moderate it. And believe me, there were times when I sat there and, oh my God, have I actually discovered something nobody else has found?
Yes.
Or it's not even discovered, because every human being has exactly the same emotional cycle. In fact, beyond that, every living thing on earth has the same emotional cycle. And I'm like, why have I come up with this? Why has nobody else come up with this? What am I meant to do with it? And I had a lot of internal struggle about what I was going to do with this to start with, because I was working in a corporate job and at home. I was married then, I'm not now. It's changed my life drastically. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, it's changed my life drastically. And I had to completely reinvent myself as well to be able to do this. That's been a journey in itself, but I won't go into that one today.
That's a can of worms that we could open another day, but that's really interesting. Now, I know obviously you've spoken about your will, but I was wondering if there were either maybe an extension of that or any other techniques that you would recommend.
Yeah. I think for me, one of the first things I like to talk to all parents and educators about is about a safe space for talking. And when we think about people that have inspired us and helped us, or people that we would turn to for support, are you going to turn to somebody who's judgmental, doesn't listen, dismisses you, say, oh, I'll talk later? Or are you going to turn to somebody who listens quietly, doesn't judge, gives you suggestions, not orders? And it's learning how to have that conversation in what I call a safe space. So actually, and it's not a physical space, it's an emotional opportunity for them to open up and talk freely without feeling in any way the conversation is going to be turned back on them and trigger them. And so for me, that safe space for learning is one of the most powerful tools you can use as an adult, as a tutor, as anybody working with teenagers and young adults. And I actually have a course on my website for learning the strategies for using that. And from there, you learn together. So as you learn to use this strategy for helping them, at least that safe space is always there every time you have a conversation. That is my absolute go-to every time. Safe space.
Nice.
Thank you.
And I noticed I had a look on your website and your other publications. Very creative, very hands-on and practical. This kind of made me start thinking is that when it comes to more creative outlets, maybe poetry, photography, coloring, how do they actually help neurodivergent teens regulate emotions? For instance, when you see those kind of coloring books.
Okay. I suppose that for me is how I've always used it for the years of raising my son through all of this and dealing with all his challenges, plus my work, my marriage problems and everything. I needed that mindfulness as a way of like when your head is constantly in that go mode, we need to balance it. And sometimes we need to have a holiday, but we don't have time for a holiday. We have 2 minutes there in the day.
Yeah.
And that creative process, even if it is mindfulness and stopping to just look at something for a couple of minutes, gives your mind a time to stop and think. And you go into what they call a flow state. So it's coming away from the stresses, away from the anxieties, away from whatever's made you angry, and just recentering. So for me, they're a way to bring all of that, like we talked earlier about catching those feelings and go, stop, breathe, and then turn things around. This is like internally in the mind, having a moment to come away from everything, stop thinking about everything else and just focus on one thing. And then the mind subconsciously starts to sort all the rest out. And very often you'll hear people talking about they're working at the computer or studying or whatever, and they're getting stressed and they're getting overwhelmed. So they go for a walk. And while they're out on a walk, all the answers come and they come back and finish their work. And that's what it's about, is giving yourself that purpose for stopping thinking and allowing that flow state to come in and letting the subconscious take over and find solutions or the motivation to keep going. So I love photography. I've always found that mindfulness in the photography and in the writing, and that's why, So in total, I've got about 18 publications now.
Oh, that was a lot. I was like, wow. Is there any sort of, I don't know, like rule or guidelines to know what type of activities allow you to enter these flow? Because I'm guessing, like, for instance, maybe playing a video game might be too overstimulating, but coloring is fine. Or is there what works and what doesn't work?
Good point, because you say video games, there's lots. And if you're playing a war game or something, chances are you're going to be overstimulating the brain. And then you end up with still this sensory moderation trying to come back out of it, and it can be dopamine seeking. There are games out there that are very mindful based. But to be honest, most games are built on purposely encouraging that dopamine seeking behavior so you get addicted to them. And they are psychologically created around creating addictive behaviors. So managing time around that is, and I actually have another podcast episode I did a couple of years ago about sensory moderation and overwhelm, and actually how addictive behaviors and that work around too much gaming and TV. That's a whole other topic. But for me, it's having that thing where whatever it is, and for some people it might be drawing, colouring, photography, going for a walk. It might be just getting on a treadmill and running. It could be sewing, doing woodwork. At the end of the day, it's whatever the individual feels comfortable doing. But if it's creativity, I think it also switches like right to left brain, and I can never remember which way it goes. But again, it's about doing something in a mindful state. So if you are running, but you're running angrily, it's not mindfully. So whatever it is, it's about moving into that mindful state of doing it, rather than, I've got to get this done because there's a deadline or a purpose. And it's the mindset around it that's more important than the process itself.
I always get a little bit confused with autopilot and mindfulness, because they sound like similar, but also complete opposite. So a lot of these activities for me is that I could do them like not thinking. Like, for instance, if you're good at woodwork, you don't even need to think about it. And that could be your mindful state. On a treadmill, you lose yourself into it. So are they the same thing?
Driving the car becomes like automated, like walking. You walk without thinking about it. But then people can drive without thinking about it, while at the same time being an absolute road hog and shouting and swearing and cursing out the window. They're not thinking about the driving process, but they can be in road rage at the same time. Or they could be driving mindfully and passively and taking notice of all the trees and the buildings and where the sun's shining through. And so mindfulness is the state, as opposed to automation, which is physically or mentally doing something so repetitively that it becomes a habit to do it without having to stop and think of the process.
Okay, that's definitely cleared it up. The way you say it, just light bulbs all over the place. I could genuinely talk to you all day, but I realize time is getting there. So I've got my last question. And this is one you briefly started upon about your kind of grand plans and how might we overcome them.
Yeah. And that is a great question to end on. And I wouldn't redesign what's already there, because everything is there for a purpose, and it is really helpful for a lot of people. So for me, there is no redesign in that sense. For me, it would be redesigning, like you say, the ability to take an extra set of tools into all of them. And I support another trauma therapist with publishing her books. And she often tells me how she's got clients in her room who are teenagers and young adults, even though she's got hypnotherapy, NLP, CBT, other modalities of therapy available to her. She's done a tremendous amount of training, but she still very often finds herself with clients that cannot access those therapies, like we talked about that gap earlier. So for me, it's not redesigning what the therapies are, it's giving that extra set of tools to all forms of therapy and education and work. I'd like to see this in leadership training as well, so it's top-down learning. And it's just having this one extra personal development model that actually powers up all the rest of them for people with neurodivergency and without.
Wow. Okay, that is a solid answer, and genuinely so much to think about from this chat. Really fascinating. I will definitely be checking out more of your work and your previous podcasts. But I would just like to say a massive thank you for attending today. I can't wait to share this with our community.
All right, thank you for having me, and it's been amazing talking to you as well. Thank you, Nat.
Cool. Cheers, Kay.